For centuries, a false story has circled the globe that Africa was a place without cities, without kings, without libraries. That story is wrong. Beneath those sweeping landscapes lay empires that commanded oceans of trade, built stone cities and universities, and shaped world history long before many European states existed. Imagine caravan routes crossing the Sahara, connecting gold fields to Mediterranean markets. Imagine cities where scholars gathered to copy manuscripts and debate law. Imagine kings whose pilgrimages to Mecca reshaped economies across continents. These are not myths, they are documented facts. The trans-Sahara gold trade that fueled West African states, the medieval learning centers of Timbuktu, and rulers like Musa I of Mali, whose 1324-25 pilgrimage became a global event. Some kingdoms fell to new weapons and foreign armies. The Songhai Empire met Moroccan gunpowder in 1591 at the Battle of Tondibi, while others were erased more slowly by colonizing powers who looted treasures and rewrote histories, as happened after the 1897 British expedition that took thousands of works from Benin City. In the south, Great Zimbabwe's towering stone walls, built and lived in between roughly the 12th and 15th centuries, quietly proved that monumental architecture and complex urban life existed across Africa on its own terms. Archaeology and radiocarbon dating have long affirmed this African authorship. This series will wake those sleeping histories. Over the next episodes, we will walk ruined palaces, read the fragments scholars have rescued, and listen for the voices that empire and empire building tried to silence. If you want to see how empires rise, fall, and are remembered, and to reclaim stories the world forgot, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the golden pulse of the Sahara.
Long before the names Mali or Timbuktu dominated the Western imagination, another power anchored the pulse of African trade. Historians call it the Ghana Empire, Wagadu in the Soninke tongue, a state that rose where the southern edge of the Sahara meets the savannah, and which between roughly the 7th and 13th centuries became the first great commercial heart of West Africa. Geography shaped Ghana's destiny. The empire sat like a hinge between two worlds. To the north lay the Sahara and the Berber and Arab traders who crossed it. To the south lay fertile lands and the gold fields of Wangara. Along these arteries, goods moved in opposite directions: salt from the desert and gold from the forest zones, ivory and kola nuts for textiles and metalwork. That exchange, simple in idea, enormous in consequence, made Ghana wealthy and made it indispensable. Wealth in Ghana was both material and institutional. The Soninke rulers did not just collect tribute, they regulated and profited from caravans, controlled trade routes, and established markets that attracted merchants from far beyond West Africa. Arabic geographers and travelers, writing from the 9th century onward, described a capital of wealth and ceremony, a place where a royal town and a Muslim merchant town stood in close proximity, separated by little more than a stretch of continuous habitation. Archaeologists today point to Kumbi Saleh as the best candidate for that urban center. If we strip away legend and stick to what can be dated or documented, several patterns emerge. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic studies at sites attributed to Ghana show occupation and urban activity from the early medieval period, with an especially active urban phase around the 9th through 12th centuries. Contemporary Arabic sources, trading manuals, geographies, and traveler accounts consistently emphasize Ghana's role as an intermediary that channeled gold into the Mediterranean world and brought North African goods into sub-Saharan markets. The mechanics of trade were practical and precise. Salt from Saharan mines, such as Tagaza, traveled in heavy slabs by camel caravans, valued not just for flavor, but for preserving food. Gold, by contrast, moved south to north in dust or nuggets, carried discreetly in small leather containers or exchanged as ingots. Because the supply of gold in West Africa was so abundant relative to the northern shores, the Ghana state could levy fees, ensure caravan safety, and set the terms of exchange, concealed levers of power that yielded visible splendor. Power also had a ceremonial face. Arabic writers describe the king, often called the Ghana, a royal title rather than a personal name, seated behind a curtain, with his voice and person mediated by a courtly apparatus. This ritual distance both protected his sacred status and directed the economy. Kings controlled the flow of gold, determining who could buy and who could sell, and placing heavy fines on anyone who attempted to smuggle bullion outside imperial channels. Those regulations were instruments of statecraft as much as commerce.
Religion and culture in Ghana were complex and adaptive. The Soninke elite practiced indigenous beliefs, but Islam spread via trade and settlement. Muslim merchants established quarters in the market towns, built mosques and reading circles, and introduced Arabic literacy and account-keeping, tools that eased long-distance trade. Yet conversion was gradual and patchwork. The royal court's public rituals and sacral kingship often remained rooted in older practices, even as new religious ideas circulated. The material traces speak to everyday life. Excavations at sites linked to Ghana reveal stone-built houses, a congregational mosque, pottery, and imported goods, glass beads, North African coins, and high-quality metalwork. Together, these finds sketch a cosmopolitan urbanism at the edge of the desert. Not a single city frozen in time, but a network of towns, caravanserais, and seasonal markets, sustained by the rhythm of weather and commerce. Yet the Ghana Empire was not invulnerable. Political pressure built from within and without. New groups and polities pressed on Ghana's peripheries. Control of gold sources shifted, and, importantly, a militant reform movement from the north, the Almoravids, a Berber Islamic confederation, intervened in the region during the 11th century. Arab chronicles claim Almoravid campaigns around 1076-77 weakened Ghana's central authority and accelerated changes already underway in trans-Saharan trade patterns. Modern historians debate the extent of that impact. Some argue the Almoravid role was decisive, others that environmental, economic, and internal political changes mattered more. The truth is likely a mix of forces that together altered Ghana's trajectory. When the empire ebbed, it did so not with a single cataclysm, but through fragmentation. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the political map of the Western Sudan was shifting. New centers of gravity rose to the south and east. Groups that had been part of Ghana's economic web began to assert autonomy, and new polities, including the Soso and later the Mali state, absorbed parts of the old realm. By around the mid-13th century, many of the regions once under Ouagadougou's sway had been integrated into emergent powers that would reconfigure West African history. To tell Ghana's story without the weight of a Eurocentric lens, we must pay attention to both the archives and the ground. Arabic manuscripts give us names, roots, and impressions. Archaeology supplies dates, domestic details, and material culture. Together, they undo simplistic narratives that reduce Ghana to legend and confirm instead that it was a functioning, adaptive, and influential state, one that organized trade on a continental scale long before large-scale Atlantic commerce redirected African flows. What does this mean for how we imagine the past? First, that complexity and connectivity were not European inventions exported to Africa. They were embedded in the continent's own networks. Second, that economic systems, caravan logistics, tax regimes, merchant communities, can create empires as surely as armies do. And third, that the visible ruins and the silent documents together invite a reconstruction of memory, not to romanticize, but to recognize competence, strategy, and human ingenuity. Visually, the Ghana world is a study in contrasts. the austerity of desert rock against the glitter of gold dust, the heat of the Sahel against the cool shade of caravan tents, the intimacy of oral court ritual against the distant authority of a king draped in ritual secrecy. We will walk those contrasts here, following routes once traveled by camels and men, and listening for the patterns of power that made Ouagadougou vital to a medieval world. But there is a final, quiet point worth underscoring. The story of Ghana is not simply one of rise and fall. It is also a story about memory, about how later histories remembered or forgot. When subsequent empires like Mali rose and historical memory shifted, some names faded. When European explorers and colonial scholars first encountered West Africa centuries later, too many assumed that silence meant absence. Archaeology, critical readings of Arabic texts, and collaboration with West African oral traditions have reassembled fragments into a coherent picture. Each new excavation, each careful translation, rekindles a voice once muffled by distance and prejudice.
The story of Mali begins where rivers gathered the life of the land. From the upper Niger floodplains rose a political idea that would reshape West Africa, a state that could organize harvests, direct trade, and project influence across distances measured not in miles, but in seasons. That state became the Mali Empire, born in the 13th century from smaller chiefdoms around Kangaba, and consolidated under a leader whose life is still sung in West African oral traditions, Sundiata Keita. Sundiata's rise, anchored by the Battle of Kirina around 1235, was the hinge between the collapse of old powers and the formation of a new imperial order. He gathered a coalition of Manding chiefs, unified trade routes, and built an administrative center at Niani that became a magnet for merchants, farmers, and artisans. While his life is filtered through epic memory, archaeology and contemporary chronicles point to a real political consolidation in the mid-1200s that underpinned Mali's later prosperity. Geography and resources made Mali strategically powerful. The empire sat astride the trans-Saharan routes that linked gold-producing forests to North African and Mediterranean markets. It controlled stretches of fertile floodplain for rice and millet, and its administrators collected tribute and regulated commerce, the levers that turned regional abundance into state capacity. The result was economic scale. Mali could finance armies, sponsor building projects, and support scholarly life. If Sundiata built the scaffolding, later rulers furnished Mali with international fame. The most famous was Mansa Musa, whose reign in the early 13th century crystallized Mali's global profile. In 1324 to 1325, Musa made a pilgrimage to Mecca with a caravan that, according to contemporary Arab chroniclers, numbered in the thousands and carried extraordinary quantities of gold. His lavish gifts and expenditures in Cairo and along the route were so pronounced that they were reported across the Islamic world and beyond, announcing Mali as an empire of remarkable wealth. Musa's pilgrimage did more than display riches. It created institutional and cultural linkages. He invited scholars, architects, and craftsmen back to Mali. He patronized mosque construction and endowed learning centers in cities like Timbuktu and Djenné. The Jingareber Mosque in Timbuktu, traditionally dated to the 1320s and associated with an Andalusian architect who traveled with Musa, stands as a visible symbol of this exchange, an African Islamic architecture grown from local techniques and wider Islamic influences. Timbuktu itself became the face of Mali's intellectual flowering. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the city's mosques and madrasas, Sankhareh among the most famous, formed a network of learning that attracted students from across the Sahel and Sahara. Their libraries accumulated thousands of manuscripts on jurisprudence, astronomy, medicine, history, and poetry. These were not mere religious tracts. They were working libraries that recorded local knowledge, adjudicated commerce, and taught across generations. UNESCO and modern scholarship recognize Timbuktu's role as a major center of learning in medieval Africa. The economic engine behind these institutions remained trade. salt from Saharan mines such as Giza, cola nuts from the forested zones, and gold from the Wangara fields moved along established routes. Merchants, both Muslim and non-Muslim, used a mix of barter, weighed gold transactions, and credit instruments. The state profited from customs duties and agreements that guaranteed caravan safety. In this way, Mali converted local resources into durable political power and a cosmopolitan urban life. Education and administration were intertwined. Timbuktu's madrasas developed systems of copying and teaching that required patronage, lodging, and marketplaces for books. Scholars such as Ahmad Baba, 1564 to 1627, though later than Musa, belonged to a lineage of jurists and teachers whose writings shaped legal practice and intellectual life across West Africa. The manuscript tradition, private, familial, and institutional, created a literary continuity that modern researchers are still uncovering and cataloging. These libraries preserved local histories and legal opinions as much as they preserved Islamic learning.
Mali's political and social order had layers. At the imperial center was the Mansa, the king of kings, whose authority ranged from direct control to symbolic overlordship over dependent rulers. Beneath him, provincial governors and local chiefs managed day-to-day affairs. Labor systems, revenue collection, and patronage networks tied villages to cities. Artisans and specialized craftsmen underwrote the material culture, textiles, metallurgy, leatherwork, that circulated with the gold. Oral historians and griots preserved the memory of these arrangements, complementing and sometimes clashing with the written records left by Arabic chroniclers. Mali's rise was neither inevitable nor simple. It depended on political skill, environmental conditions, and the contingencies of trade. Climatic variations influenced the productivity of the floodplains. Competition over gold sources and routes created pressure, and the spread of Islam, while enriching intellectual life, also introduced new geopolitical dynamics tied to the wider Islamic world. These interacting factors made Mali adaptable and, during its peak, deeply connected. But empires are always contested. As Mali projected power, new polities to the east and north accumulated strength. The Songhai polity, long within Mali's economic orbit, grew more assertive. By the 15th century, Songhai leaders were consolidating their own empire along the Middle Niger, centered on Gao, and later on the city of Gao's rival, Timbuktu's neighbor, Djenné. This shift did not happen overnight. It followed decades of political negotiation, military campaigns, and realignments of trading alliances. The transition from Mali to Songhai dominance illustrates a common pattern in pre-modern West Africa. Imperial authority often depended on managing networks rather than controlling territory in a modern sense. When the networks reoriented because of changing trade routes, rising local elites, or military pressure, the political center could shift. Mali's influence receded as Songhai capitalized on the same rivers and routes that had once sustained Mali's power. Yet, decline did not erase Mali's cultural legacy. Timbuktu's manuscripts survived centuries of change, and Mali's institutional innovations, tax regimes, caravan regulation, patronage of learning, left templates that successor states adapted. Even the stories sung by griots continued to instruct communities about law, lineage, and political morality. Modern scholarship, archaeological digs, paleo-environmental studies, and careful readings of Arabic sources has increasingly treated Mali as a real, historically grounded empire whose networked power shaped a large portion of West Africa for centuries. The material traces are revealing. Excavations at Niani, Djenné, and other sites show urban planning, imported ceramics, metallurgical activity, and structures related to trade and learning. Radiocarbon dating places intense urban and commercial activity from the 13th through the 15th centuries in many of these centers. Manuscripts, some of which survived war, drought, and neglect, offer a textual mirror. legal opinions, astronomical tables, medical recipes, and local histories that testify to a literate, scholarly world in the Sahel. Understanding Mali also means recognizing the ways its fame was filtered through outside observers. Arab geographers and traders wrote about the empire's wealth and the spectacle of Musa's pilgrimage. Later, European explorers and colonial scholars sometimes downplayed or misunderstood local institutions. To reconstruct Mali, we must read multiple archives, Arabic manuscripts, oral histories, and material culture together, letting each correct the partialities of the others. Finally, Mali's story matters because it reframes familiar assumptions about medieval global history. While Europe was emerging from its feudal patchwork, West Africa had large states that linked the Atlantic forest to the Mediterranean world through trade, law, and learning. Timbuktu's libraries and the administrative reach of the Mali state show that intellectual life and material prosperity flourished on African terms. Rediscovering these facts refines our picture of the past, not a single center of civilization, but many interconnected centers that shaped a shared world.
The Songhai story is, first and last, a river story. Where the Niger bends and spreads into fertile floodplains, people settled, farmed, and bartered. Those rhythms of water and season became the foundations of power, wealthy towns, surplus production, and a steady stream of traders. From those riverbanks grew an empire that in the 15th and 16th centuries came to dominate much of West Africa, the Songhai. Songhai's rise was not sudden, it was cumulative. For centuries, the city of Gao had been a commercial hub on the Middle Niger. By the later medieval era, under ambitious rulers, Gao became the nucleus for expansion. One of the most consequential figures was Soni Ali, also spelled Soni Ali, who reigned roughly from 1464 to 1492. He expanded Songhai's reach by seizing Timbuktu in about 1468 and Djenné soon after, combining military force with savvy control of trade routes. Soni Ali built an army that could move on horseback across the plains and support river operations, and he created the basic territorial spine of what became the Songhai Empire. Soni Ali's reputation among Islamic scholars was mixed. While he defended and enlarged the state, he was sometimes criticized by Muslim elites for retaining traditional religious practices and for ruthlessness in politics. That tension between the demands of governing a multi-religious, multi-ethnic realm and the expectations of increasingly literate Muslim merchant classes shaped the next transformation of Songhai's political life. The decisive reshaping came under Askia Muhammad, also known as Askia the Great, who seized power in 1493 and reigned into the 1520s. Askia reorganized government. He instituted tax and bureaucratic offices, standardized weights and measures for trade, and extended Songhai's diplomatic ties across the Islamic world. He also embraced Islamic scholarship and allied himself with Timbuktu's learned men, which strengthened the city's institutional role as a center of jurisprudence and learning. Askia's reforms centralized authority in a way that made Songhai both militarily potent and administratively sophisticated. Songhai's power had practical foundations. Control of the Niger floodplain allowed the state to harvest food surpluses and support specialist craftsmen. Riverine logistics, fleets of boats, amphibious troop movements, and control of river ports were central to projecting force and maintaining commerce. Cities like Gao, Timbuktu, and Djenné became nodes in a network that handled gold, salt, cola nuts, cloth, and slaves. The state taxed caravans, regulated markets, and protected trade routes, converting commerce into revenue that paid soldiers and funded public works. Timbuktu under Songhai
offers a clear window into how power and learning reinforced each other. The Sankor and Jingare mosques were more than places of worship. They were schools and libraries. Manuscript culture flourished. Legal opinions, Quranic commentary, medical treatises, and astronomical texts circulated in the hands of scholars and students. Askia's patronage encouraged scholars to teach, copy, and debate. Scholars, in turn, gave the state legitimacy in the eyes of Muslim traders and jurists from North Africa and the Maghreb. This created an intellectual magnet that made Timbuktu central to both religion and commerce. Militarily, Songhai combined cavalry, infantry, and river forces. Light cavalry could sweep across the plains and secure distant towns. Infantry and garrison troops held the cities and trade routes. Riverboats moved men and supplies along the Niger, enabling seasonal campaigns timed with the river's ebb and flow. This flexibility made Songhai hard to dislodge for generations, until a new factor entered the region's strategic equation: gunpowder.
The appearance of firearms and artillery in West African warfare did not happen in isolation. By the late 16th century, North African states like Morocco had access to gunpowder weapons and a military-industrial capacity that West African polities lacked. In 1590-91, Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur of Morocco commissioned an invasion force led by Judar Pasha to seize control of trans-Saharan trade and the gold that sustained the Saudi court. That expedition crossed the desert, reached the Niger, and confronted Songhai forces at Tondibi on March 13, 1591. There, the Saudian army, equipped with arquebuses and cannons, defeated a numerically larger Songhai force, demonstrating the lethal advantage of firearms against traditional cavalry tactics. The Moroccan victory at Tondibi precipitated the collapse of Songhai as a unified empire. But a simplistic guns beat swords story misses crucial context. Songhai's vulnerability in 1591 was the product of long-term political strains, succession disputes after the death of strong rulers, administrative fragmentation, and the sheer difficulty of defending a vast, riverine empire against a well-organized external expedition. When Morocco arrived, Songhai could not muster a cohesive strategic response. The result was not merely battlefield defeat, but the breakdown of central authority, followed by decades of fragmentation into smaller polities and contested provinces. The Moroccan occupation itself proved fragile. Although the Saadians sacked cities, they lacked the logistical capacity to govern an immense territory across the Sahara. Their control centered on key commercial nodes and garrisons, and they relied on local intermediaries to extract tribute. Over time, resistance and the logistical strain of long supply lines eroded Moroccan authority, and the political map of the Niger Valley splintered. Former Songhai elites retreated into successor states, notably the Dendi Kingdom to the east, preserving elements of Songhai identity even after imperial collapse. Beyond campaigns and collapse, Songhai's social fabric is important to remember. The empire consisted of many peoples: Songhai, Mande, Fulani, Tuareg, Hausa, and others, each contributing to the economy and military. The state relied on local chiefs to collect taxes, muster troops, and manage irrigation and marketplaces. Artisans created the metalwork, textiles, and leather goods that traveled with caravans. Fishermen and farmers maintained the food base. Clerics and scholars managed courts and legal arbitration. This interdependence meant that Songhai's institutions were woven into daily life across a wide zone, a fact that made collapse disruptive in ways that lasted generations. Economically, Songhai benefited from being the middle link in long-distance exchange. Gold from forested zones moved north, salt came from Sahara mines like Giza, the Niger itself carried rice, fish, and other staples. Songhai's elite used customs, market dues, and tribute to finance armies and state works. They also participated in diplomatic exchange. Embassies and pilgrim routes tied Songhai to North African and Mediterranean networks.
Askia Muhammad's own pilgrimage to Mecca in 1497-98, for example, strengthened ties with Islamic learning centers and confirmed Songhai as a recognized polity within the wider Muslim world. The cultural legacy of Songhai survives in manuscripts, oral traditions, and material remains. Timbuktu's manuscripts, some of which date from the 14th to the 17th centuries, preserve legal rulings, family histories, and scientific notes that reflect a literate elite engaging with cosmopolitan learning. Oral historians, griots, and local chroniclers keep memory alive through praise songs and genealogies that recount the deeds of rulers like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad. Archaeology at sites in Gao, Guinea, and along the Niger floodplain reveals settlement patterns, pottery styles, and evidence of long-distance exchange that corroborate textual sources. Together, these lines of evidence show a civilization that was both adaptive and innovative. For us today, Songhai raises several important lessons. First, geography matters. Control of rivers can be as decisive as control of plains or coasts. Second, institutional flexibility, the ability to tax, adjudicate, and direct labor seasonally, is a core ingredient of durable states. Third, technological gaps can be decisive when they intersect with political weakness. Firearms mattered in 1591 because Songhai could not rebuild cohesive central control fast enough to absorb the shock. Finally, the story reminds us how memory is assembled. Scraps of Arabic chronicles, local oral memory, and the stubborn evidence of the earth itself combine to build a credible picture. Visually, Songhai offers cinematic contrasts. Long river horizons, sun-baked plazas ringing with merchants, the hush of mosque courtyards where pens scratch on parchment, and the sudden thunder of mounted cavalry. To tell this story, we will move from the intimate, a classroom copying a legal opinion by candlelight, to the sweeping, a caravan threading the Sahel, a fleet of boats cutting the Niger, and finally, the guns of the Saadian army transforming the horizon at Tondibi. Each image is a piece of the larger puzzle.
The Kingdom of Benin was not the modern country called Benin. It was a sovereign, court-centered civilization centered on what is today Benin City in southern Nigeria. For centuries, its power was expressed as much through art as through spear and treaty. Benin's court produced an extraordinary visual language, cast brass plaques, ceremonial heads, and regalia that recorded court ritual, diplomatic encounters, and the names of rulers. These works were not decorative afterthoughts. They were instruments of statecraft, media for memory, law, and authority. The story of Benin's rise is anchored in the consolidation of royal power under strong monarchs. While the polity's deeper origins reach into earlier centuries, the transformation into a territorial state is commonly dated to the era of Oba Eware the Great, who reigned roughly 1440 to 1480. Eware reformed succession, reorganized palace ritual, and expanded Benin's territorial control, turning a fortified city into a complex capital linked by roads, moats, and administrative networks. His reign set patterns, court hierarchy, guild organization, and ceremonial displays that shaped Benin for the next several centuries. Benin's economy and diplomacy grew from its place on Atlantic and inland trade networks. From the late 15th century, Portuguese visitors recorded contact with Benin's court, exchanging cloth, copper and brass manillas, and other goods. These contacts introduced new metal supplies and foreign objects into court craft, but Benin's artists and guilds absorbed these materials into an indigenous aesthetic and political logic. The court's wealth derived from tribute, controlled trade, and the productive hinterland, and the palace transformed that wealth into an enduring material record. The court's artisans formed specialized guilds, centered on streets such as Igan, the traditional metalworkers' quarter. Using the lost wax casting technique, they produced high-relief plaques and naturalistic portrait heads, objects of technical sophistication and narrative density. Plaques depicted war, diplomacy, ritual, and foreign visitors. Heads commemorated ancestors and important figures. These objects were placed on ancestral altars and palace verandas where they performed political memory, proclaiming lineage, legitimizing the Oba, and mediating relations between ruler and people. The material technology mattered. Skilled carvers modeled wax originals. Casters invested furnaces and alloys. Finishers chased details and inlaid eyes. Scientific study shows that from the 15th and 16th centuries onward, Benin casters used copper alloy metal of variable composition, often brass, sometimes traced through geochemical analysis to European-supplied sources. That metal was melted, cast, and transformed into complex narrative surfaces that carried both court biography and artistic innovation. These were not crude imitations of foreign models, but locally developed masterpieces. Benin's court ritual was as visual as its art. The Oba, regarded as a sacred king, wore coral regalia, sat behind coral screens, and presided over ceremonies where art and symbol reinforced hierarchy. The palace was a theater of power. The display of brass, ivory, and coral narrated the Oba's lineage, martial success, and divine mandate. The objects themselves functioned as law books. A foreign envoy's portrait, a war scene, or a court procession could be read by chiefs and visiting delegations as authoritative claims about past deeds and current status. Contact with Europe intensified after the late 15th century. Portuguese, Dutch, and later British and other European traders anchored posts along the coast and engaged in commerce that included cloth, arms, and manillas, ring-shaped brass ingots used as currency. While trade brought new materials and technologies, Benin's political culture regulated interactions tightly. Foreigners could enter court under strict protocol, diplomatic gifts were formalized, and the Oba maintained control over who traded and on what terms. This tight choreography helped Benin retain agency even as Atlantic trade expanded.
The palace's visual program also reflected a long memory of warfare and diplomacy. Many plaques celebrate successful campaigns, tribute missions, and the enthronement of rulers. These reliefs are sometimes mistaken for mere decoration. Instead, they are court documents in bronze, chronological markers, genealogical claims, and moral exemplars. Scholars read them in conjunction with oral histories and European reports to reconstruct political events, such as military expeditions that extended Benin's influence into the delta and coastal zones. This concentration of prestige and of portable art made Benin a target in the age of empire. In February 1897, after a tense episode in which a British delegation was ambushed while traveling to Benin City, British forces launched a punitive expedition that captured and sacked the city. Soldiers looted thousands of objects from the palace, plaques, heads, regalia, and thousands of pieces dispersed across museums and private collections in Europe and beyond. That seizure dramatically altered global access to Benin's artistic heritage and became a flashpoint for later debates over colonial looting and cultural restitution. The dispersal of objects after 1897 created both a global awareness of Benin art and a bitter legacy. Museums such as the British Museum, the Pitt Rivers, and institutions across Europe acquired and displayed Benin works, often with little context about their removal. For generations, Western audiences admired the aesthetics while ignorance persisted about the violent circumstances of acquisition. Today, those same pieces are central to Nigeria's calls for restitution and to scholarly reassessments that emphasize provenance, colonial violence, and the rights of local custodians. The modern restitution movement has produced concrete returns. In recent years, institutions and governments have begun repatriating looted artifacts to Nigeria, both as an ethical correction and as a matter of cultural policy. Notably, in 2025, the Netherlands returned 119 Benin bronzes to Nigeria, a substantial handover that followed formal requests and negotiations. These repatriations are reshaping how Benin's history is curated, conserved, and displayed.
and they raise complex questions about ownership, museum stewardship, and the best ways to restore cultural memory. Repatriation is more than moving objects. It is part of reconstructing institutional memory. Nigeria and Benin's royal authorities are working to build conservation facilities and museums, projects that acknowledge the technical demands of preserving bronze and organic materials, while centering local narratives and ceremonial contexts. These initiatives also aim to reinsert artifacts into the ritual landscapes for which they were made: ancestral altars, palace spaces, and public ceremonies where objects regain their original communicative functions, rather than remaining static in foreign display cases. Yet the story of Benin is not reducible to its looting. The kingdom's internal dynamics, court politics, guild regulation, succession disputes, and the balancing of military and diplomatic strategies sustained a complex polity across centuries. Obas navigated court factions, managed tributary chiefs, and mediated relationships with hinterland communities. The palace's ceremonial calendar and legal conventions structured life across social strata, while artisans passed techniques down generationally in tightly controlled workshops. This institutional depth made Benin culturally resilient. Artistically, Benin's innovations influenced neighboring polities and left a legacy that modern artists still reference. The naturalistic portraiture, the narrative sequencing on plaques, and the scale of palace decoration created a visual grammar that communicated power with clarity and force. Even where European collectors misunderstood the functions of objects, the technical mastery and narrative density of Benin art forced a reassessment of African artistic histories, overturning old prejudices that dismissed African work as primitive, and revealing instead highly developed aesthetic and metallurgical traditions. For historians and curators, interpreting Benin demands multiple archives. Oral historians and palace chronicles preserve genealogies and ritual meanings that complement archaeological finds. European travel accounts offer external observations, often biased, that must be weighed carefully. And the objects themselves, their iconography, placement, and material, remain among the most reliable witnesses of court ideology. Together, these sources let us read a court that performed power publicly and carved memory into metal for generations to see. In the end, Benin's central lesson is about the politics of image-making. The kingdom turned art into an instrument of government. It mapped lineage, recorded conquest, and staged authority. When those images were removed by force, the kingdom's visual memory was fractured. Returning them does not automatically repair that rupture, but it creates the institutional conditions to restore continuity. As museums and communities negotiate how to display and care for these works, the conversation itself forces a reckoning with history, about who gets to tell it and where those stories should live. Visually, our episode will alternate close, tactile scenes, a caster molding wax, the sheen of chased brass under a lamp, coral beads threaded on royal collars, with wide shots of Benin City's moats, the coastline, and the vast networks through which trade flowed. We will let the plaques speak, reading their scenes aloud, matching them to oral accounts, and showing how material detail confirms or corrects written reports. This is a story of aesthetics, power, and memory, a court that spoke in metal. Perched on a high ridge of granite outcrops in southeastern Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe is one of the most striking archaeological testimonies to pre-colonial Southern African statecraft. A vast complex of dry stone walls and enclosures built without mortar, rising in sweeping curves that seem to echo the landscape itself. Excavations and scientific dating placed the main phase of construction roughly between the 11th and 15th centuries, with occupation continuing in parts of the site into the later medieval period. These are not isolated ruins. They were the heart of a polity that managed resources, trade, craft production, and ritual life for centuries. The scale of Great Zimbabwe astonished early European visitors. More recent archaeological surveys show the site covers nearly 7 square kilometers in its broader occupation zone, with the stone masonry concentrated in 3 main sectors, commonly called the Hill Complex, the Valley Complex, and the Great Enclosure. The Great Enclosure's outer wall reaches heights of up to 11 meters and runs for about 250 meters in circumference, a monumental feat of dry stone construction whose walls taper from a broad base to a narrower apex, engineered for stability without using mortar. The identity of the builders was once a site of bitter colonial contention. Early European observers, refusing the idea that large, sophisticated stoneworks could be African, proposed overseas or mythical authors. Scientific archaeology overturned that prejudice. Systematic excavations, notably those by David Randall McIver in the early 20th century and Gertrude Caton Thompson's decisive work in 1929, documented local ceramic sequences, ironworking debris, and stratified deposits that tied the masonry to indigenous Bantu-speaking communities ancestral to today's Shona peoples. Caton Thompson's methods and conclusions helped establish a medieval African origin for the site, a finding reinforced by later fieldwork and radiocarbon dating. Great Zimbabwe's architecture is practical and symbolic at once. The conical tower inside the Great Enclosure, the layered inner and outer walls, and the planned courtyards suggest a landscape reshaped for elite residence, ritual, and the control of craft and storage spaces. Some specialists interpret the conical tower as a symbolic silo or a marker of status. Others see it as an architectural emblem knitted into ritual palace. Whatever its exact function, the tower and the enclosing walls read like a public script, the built environment declaring authority, lineage, and control over people and goods. Material culture from the site reveals wide-ranging connections. Archaeologists have recovered glass beads, carnelian, Islamic and Chinese ceramic sherds, and fragments of worked metal, evidence that Great Zimbabwe sat at the inland terminus of long trade chains linking the interior to the Indian Ocean world via Swahili coast ports like Sofala and Kilwa. These exotic imports were not mere curiosities. They were incorporated into elite display and exchange systems that legitimized rulers and bound local communities into broader economic networks. The presence of foreign goods alongside locally made pottery, iron slag, and building debris shows a mixed economy of craft specialization and long-distance commerce. Trade was not an abstract flow, but an organized process. The plateau and river systems around Great Zimbabwe produced cattle, agricultural surpluses, and gold from nearby deposits, commodities that drew coastal traders inland. Swahili merchant intermediaries, employing dhows and coastal entrepôts, linked the Indian Ocean world to the Zimbabwean plateau. Portuguese sources from the early 16th century, when European presence in the region began, described a pattern of commerce centered on Sofala's gold trade. Later archaeological finds of Chinese ceramics and Islamic trade goods corroborate a durable, centuries-long exchange. Internally, Great Zimbabwe appears to have been a socially differentiated settlement. Within the stone enclosures, archaeologists have identified traces of high-status contexts, platforms, paved surfaces, and spaces where luxury items appear concentrated, while the outlying ridge and valley contain evidence of more ordinary domestic architecture, hut platforms, hearths, and midden deposits. This suggests a court-centered polity in which elites lived and performed ritual within the stone precincts, while broader populations lived in more perishable structures nearby, providing labor, craft goods, and food. Craft specialization at Great Zimbabwe included advanced ironworking and weaving, alongside skilled pottery and bead manufacture. Metalworking debris and slag at multiple loci indicate that iron smelting and smithing were integral to the local economy. The iron tools and weaponry produced would have supported agriculture, construction, and defense. The artistic expression, locally made soapstone bird carvings, for instance, became emblems of the polity and today figure in Zimbabwe's national iconography, illustrating the deep cultural continuity from the medieval site to the present.
Scientific dating methods anchor the chronology. Radiocarbon dates from hearths, habitation layers, and associated contexts indicate major construction began by the 11th-12th centuries, with significant building activity and occupation continuing through the 13th-15th centuries. While absolute dates vary by site and context, the overall sequence supports a long period of growth and consolidation during the High Medieval era, a temporal window that aligns with broader shifts in Southern African political geography and Indian Ocean trade dynamics. Great Zimbabwe's decline and abandonment by the 15th-16th centuries remain subjects of careful study rather than simple answers. Scholars point to multiple interacting causes: the reorientation of trade routes that favored other coastal centers, possible environmental pressures and resource exhaustion in the surrounding landscape, internal political shifts as authority fragmented or relocated, and the disruptive arrival of Portuguese influence on the coast in the 16th century, which changed the commercial geography of the region. In short, decline appears to reflect changes in trade, ecology, and politics rather than a single catastrophic event. The European encounter complicated how Great Zimbabwe was perceived and preserved. Early colonial narratives often denied authorship and used the ruins to justify imperialist myths. Museums and texts exported fragments of material culture while misrepresenting context. The corrective work of 20th-century archaeologists and the growing involvement of local scholars and communities have shifted interpretation toward locally grounded narratives that situate Great Zimbabwe within the longue durée of Southern African history. UNESCO's designation of the site as a World Heritage Property in 1986 formalized its global significance and encouraged conservation and research in partnership with Zimbabwean authorities. Methodologically, Great Zimbabwe showcases how archaeology reconstructs past lifeways. It is not enough to marvel at walls. Researchers combine stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, typologies of pottery and beads, metallurgical analyses, paleo-environmental studies, and careful reading of early accounts to build a multi-perspectival history. Oral traditions and local memory also contribute, offering genealogies and ritual knowledge that complement material evidence. This interdisciplinary approach helps avoid simplistic, externally imposed narratives and recovers a more textured past. Great Zimbabwe's symbolic power endures. The carved soapstone birds and the massive walls became icons of African achievement, appropriated variously by nationalist movements in the 20th century and invoked in debates about identity, heritage, and restitution. Yet the site resists reduction to a single meaning. It was a living place, a seat of political authority, a nodal point in long-distance commerce, and a center of craft and ritual complexity. Recognizing that multiplicity helps us respect the people who built and lived at Great Zimbabwe as agents who shaped their world, not as passive recipients of external influence. For audiences today, Great Zimbabwe offers lessons about how states form and how material culture carries memory. Stone walls preserve outlines of political imagination. Imported beads and ceramics record conversations with far-off strangers. Hearths and slag tell of daily industry and labor. The ruins insist that South Africa participated in a networked medieval world,
one in which the interior's resources, the knowledge of local craft, and the diplomacy of rulers connected the plateau to distant oceans. Visually, our episode will move from the monumental to the intimate, sweeping drone panoramas that reveal the choreography of walls and enclosures, hands brushing mortarless seams of fitted granite, archaeological trenches exposing dark ash layers and bead-filled pits, and reconstituted scenes of courtyard life where chiefs convene, smiths hammer, and traders weigh goods. Intercut with these images, we will place the voices of scholars, local custodians, and oral historians, letting different archives speak to the same stones. Great Zimbabwe remains a stone mystery to those who refuse to look closely. When archaeologists listen to the stratified earth, when historians read trade networks and oral memory together, a coherent, compelling narrative emerges, a medieval polity of craft, ritual, and commerce that reshaped its landscape and engaged the wider Indian Ocean world. As we leave these walls, remember the larger point. Civilizations leave many kinds of traces. If we follow them with care, the past returns in vivid human detail.
The story of Nubia and Kush begins not at Egypt's edge, but along the southern Nile, where cataracts, cliffs, and fertile pockets shaped distinct societies that long traded, fought, and intermarried with their northern neighbor. From the collapse of Egypt's new kingdom emerged a resilient polity in the region of Napata, near modern Karima, that we now call the Kingdom of Kush. This kingdom, rooted in local political traditions and deeply influenced by Egyptian religion and administration, became powerful enough to cross the Nile and rule Egypt itself during the so-called 25th dynasty. The Kushite polity consolidated its identity across two major phases. The earlier Napatan phase, roughly 1st millennium BCE, centered on Napata and the religious cult of Amun at Jebel Barkal. Later, from about the 3rd century BCE onward, the political center moved south to Meroe, in the semi-arid plains between the 5th and 6th cataracts, marking the Meroitic period. Each phase left distinct archaeological and cultural signatures. Napata emphasized Egyptian-style temple construction and royal burials near the 4th cataract, while Meroe developed its own script, Meroitic, distinctive pyramidal tombs, and a vibrant ironworking and trade economy. The moment that crystallized Nubia's international stature occurred in the 8th to 7th centuries BCE, when Kushite rulers, under leaders such as Pi, often rendered Pianki, consolidated power in Nubia and pushed north into Egypt. Pi's campaign, formerly dated to the mid-8th century BCE, ended with the submission of several Delta and Upper Egyptian rulers and the assertion of Kushite authority over Egypt. Kushite rulers adopted full pharaonic titulari and styles, styling themselves as restorers of Egyptian religious order and patrons of Amun. This political reversal reframed the Nile world. Nubia was no longer merely Egypt's periphery, but a central player in pharaonic politics. Rulers of the 25th dynasty, often called the Black Pharaohs in older literature, strove to revive monumental building programs and religious conservatism in Egypt. Kings such as Shabaka, Shabitku, and especially Taharka embraced Egyptian models. They built and restored temples, inscribed stelae in Egyptian hieroglyphics, and sponsored monumental works at Thebes, Karnak, and other cult centers. Taharka's reign, conventionally dated c. 690 to 664 BCE, is well documented in both Egyptian inscriptions and foreign sources. He expanded temple constructions, secured prosperity in years of high Nile inundation, and projected power into the Levant in a complex web of alliances and confrontations. The Kushite pharaoh's identity was distinctive because it fused Nubian and Egyptian traditions in ways that legitimized rule over both lands. They claimed the Egyptian divine kingship
while retaining Nubian royal practices and iconographies. Jebel Barkal, a sacred cliff near Napata, became a symbolic focal point. Kushite kings emphasized their ties to the Amun cult there, asserting both religious legitimacy and a geopolitical claim that linked southern sanctity with northern ambition. This blending of religious and political idioms was central to Kushite statecraft. Contact and conflict with other great powers shaped the dynasty's fate. Egypt's revival under the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the 7th century BCE brought confrontation. Assyrian kings, most notably Esarhaddon and Ashurbanipal, mounted campaigns into Egypt that undermined Kushite control. While Taharqa resisted Assyrian advances, there are inscriptions and accounts showing Kushite troops in the Levant and the defense of Egyptian territories. The military pressure from the Assyrians, combined with shifting internal politics, eventually forced the Kushite rulers back toward their southern heartlands by the late 7th century BCE. Thus the era of Kushite pharaohs in Egypt closed, but not before leaving a notable architectural and religious imprint on the Nile Valley. After retreating from Egypt, Kushite power reoriented itself in the Meroitic phase. From roughly the 3rd century BCE, Meroe became the major political center. Here, the rulers developed a distinctive material culture, pyramidal tombs that differ in proportion from Egyptian models, the use of a Meroitic script alongside Egyptian iconography, and an economy heavily based on iron production, agriculture, and long-distance trade. Meroe's hinterland was rich in hardwood and iron ore, resources that underpinned an ironworking industry whose slag heaps attest to intensive metallurgical activity. This industry enabled local production of tools and weapons and provided tradable goods for coastal and Red Sea markets. The Meroitic economy was connected to Afro-Eurasian networks. Trade routes linked the Sudanese plains to the Red Sea ports, and through them to Arabian, Hellenistic, and later Roman markets. Archaeological finds at Meroe and related sites include luxury imports, Roman glass, Mediterranean amphora, beads, and even Eastern trade goods, which demonstrate the kingdom's participation in wider commercial circuits. Gold, ivory, exotic animals, and possibly slaves moved north and east, while manufactured ironwork and locally produced goods flowed toward coastal trade hubs. These exchanges made Meroe a commercial hub well into the early centuries CE. Religion and royal ideology at Meroe retained Egyptian elements. Temples to Amun and other deities continued, but they also showed local innovations. Royal imagery combined pharaonic regalia with distinctive Kushite motifs. The Meroitic script, partially deciphered, appears on monuments and funerary inscriptions, signifying a local literate tradition that coexisted with Egyptian hieroglyphic and demotic forms. Funerary practices retained the pyramidic tomb tradition, albeit in smaller, steep-sided pyramids, clustered in cemeteries that testified to dynastic continuity and an enduring concern with ancestor cults.
The archaeological record gives us chronological anchors. Radiocarbon dating, stratigraphy, and inscriptions place the Napatan ascendancy in the 1st millennium BCE, the 25th dynasty's rule over Egypt between approximately 744 to 656 BCE, and the flourishing of the Meroitic phase from around the 3rd century BCE into the early centuries of the Common Era. These broad timeframes help us see Kush as a long-lived, adaptive kingdom that reconfigured itself over centuries rather than a fleeting regional phenomenon. Technology and craft mattered to Kushite resilience. Metallurgical analysis shows that Meroitic ironworking was intensive and sustained. Slag mounds around Meroe indicate the scale of production. Inscriptions and reliefs also emphasize royal patronage of craftsmanship and the circulation of objects in ritual and diplomatic life. The practical ability to produce iron locally, tools, agricultural implements, weapons, gave Kush economic autonomy and military capacity that buttressed its political independence.
The decline of Meroe remains a subject of study and likely reflects multiple interacting factors: environmental pressure, deforestation from iron production, shifts in rainfall patterns, and changes in trade routes, particularly with the rise of Aksum and altered Red Sea commerce, contributed to economic strain. Political fragmentation and external pressures, including incursions by nomadic groups from the south and east, strained state resources. By around the 4th to 6th century CE, the royal centers at Meroe were abandoned, and power in the region shifted toward other polities. Yet the cultural legacy of Kush persisted in successor kingdoms and in regional memory. Throughout these centuries, Kush maintained a dynamic relationship with Egypt, sometimes conquering, sometimes coexisting, and often exchanging people, ideas, and religious forms. Kushite rulers adopted Egyptian court forms deliberately, not out of imitation alone, but as strategic language. Egyptian kingship conferred international prestige and sacred sanction across the Nile. Conversely, Kush contributed distinctive architectural forms, burial practices, and regional diplomacy that shaped Nile politics in difficult and creative ways. Recognizing this mutual shaping undoes simplistic center-periphery models and shows two river civilizations in complex conversation. Our modern understanding of Kush comes from a range of sources: temple inscriptions and royal stelae in both Egyptian and Meroitic scripts, the architecture that survives at Napata and Meroe, foreign accounts, including Assyrian and classical authors, and archaeological science, radiocarbon dates, metallurgical studies, and landscape analyses. Together, they produce a consistent picture of a kingdom that combined local innovation with trans-Nile ambition. Scholars today emphasize careful integration of these sources to avoid earlier eras of projection and speculation. What does the Kushite story teach us? First, that power flows along rivers as well as across deserts. Control of sacred sites, fertile floodplains, and trade routes can produce regional empires. Second, that cultural borrowing is often political. Adopting the symbols and language of a neighboring civilization can be an act of statecraft, not mere imitation. Third, that technology, iron making, textile production, and stone and mud brick construction underpinned long-term social complexity. And finally, that the historical record gains depth when inscriptions, material culture, and scientific dating are read together. Visually, the episode will alternate close study and grand panorama. The preserved columns and reliefs at Karnak that bear Kushite cartouches, the stark silhouette of pyramids at Nuri and Meroe under a red sky, the smoldering remains of ancient furnaces and slag banks, and the cliff face at Jebel Barkal, where sand and stone bear witness to centuries of ritual authority. We will hear the voices of epigraphers, archaeologists, and Sudanese custodians who connect past rituals to present identities. As we leave the Nile's southern kingdoms and head for the Swahili coast, carry this image: a kingdom that could don pharaonic regalia and rule in Memphis, yet also melt ore at Meroe and write its name in a script all its own. Kush was neither a shadow of Egypt nor an imitation of it. It was a powerful polity with its own strategies, technologies, and religious claims, one that repeatedly reshaped the political geography of Northeast Africa.
The Swahili coast was not a single kingdom, but a string of city-states: Kilwa, Sofala, Mombasa, Lamu, Songo Manara, Zanzibar, and many others that rose along East Africa's shoreline and islands to form one of the medieval world's most connected maritime worlds. From roughly the 9th century onward, these towns stitched the African interior into the wider Indian Ocean economy, exchanging ivory, gold, and timber for cloth, pottery, beads, and spices from Arabia, India, and China. Their power came from the sea: monsoon winds, agile dhows, and a commercial culture that turned shores into meeting points for goods, people, and ideas. The origins were local and adaptive. Bantu-speaking agricultural communities settled the coast centuries before the medieval era. Their villages evolved into towns as coastal trade intensified. Over time, an urban culture, later called Swahili, after the Kiswahili language that grew from Bantu roots with heavy borrowings from Arabic and other languages, emerged. While some Swahili origin stories emphasize foreign founders from Persia or Arabia, archaeological and historical research shows a more complex picture. Local African societies adopted and adapted foreign elements, Islam, certain architectural techniques, mercantile practices, and in doing so, created a distinct, hybrid maritime civilization. Kilwa Kisiwani provides one of the clearest case studies of this transformation. Founded by at least the 9th century and flourishing from the 13th to the 15th centuries, Kilwa became an entrepot for gold transported from the Zimbabwean plateau and other interior zones to the Indian Ocean. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan traveler who visited in 1331, called Kilwa one of the most perfect and well-constructed cities he had seen, a testimony to its wealth and urban sophistication in the medieval period. Archaeology, coral stone mosques, Husuni Kubwa Palace foundations, imported Chinese ceramics, confirms Kilwa's role as a major hub in long-distance exchange. The mechanics of Indian Ocean trade were shaped by monsoon winds that reversed direction seasonally, enabling predictable sailing schedules between East Africa, Arabia, India, and beyond. Swahili merchants, often organized in family networks and merchant houses, coordinated shipments of East African goods, gold, ivory, tortoiseshell, and later enslaved people, while importing silk, cotton textiles, beads, and spices from Arabia, India, and China. The coastal entrepôts did not merely pass goods through, they added value through storage, repackaging, and insurance-like arrangements that underwrote risk in a long-distance circuit. These commercial practices made the coast integral to Afro-Eurasian commerce for centuries. Urbanism on the coast produced distinctive architecture adapted to coral rag and mangrove environments. Mosques and houses were built of coral stone and lime mortar, often fashioned into carved mihrabs, decorated doorways, and public courtyards. The Great Mosque of Kilwa, with its domed bays and coral construction, is one of the oldest surviving monuments on the coast and illustrates both Islamic liturgical life and local building technology. Palaces like Husuni Kubwa show that rulers invested in monumental architecture that signaled authority to neighbors and visiting merchants alike. Religion and identity were important glue. Islam arrived early via traders and missionaries. By the medieval centuries, many coastal elites had adopted Islam, often combining it with local practices. Mosques were centers of learning, law, and community, spaces where Quranic education spread Arabic literacy and connected East Africa to Islamic intellectual networks from Cairo to Gujarat. Yet, Swahili identity remained plural. Many towns retained strong local languages, customs, and kinship ties, even as rulers adopted Islamic titles and diplomatic practices. Political life on the coast was diverse. Some cities developed powerful sultanates that projected influence inland through alliances with hinterland chiefs. Others remained merchant oligarchies, where leading families controlled trade and judicial affairs. The political geography shifted over time. At different moments, Kilwa, Mombasa, Pate, and later Zanzibar mattered most. Control of safe harbors and the ability to tax trade determined local wealth and influence more than fixed territorial size. European penetration altered this equilibrium dramatically. Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498 marked Europe's entry into the Indian Ocean system and foreshadowed conflict over trade monopolies. Portuguese expeditions in the early 1500s sought maritime control of strategic ports. In 1505, the Portuguese led punitive raids and interventions along the coast, including the sacking of Kilwa,
that weakened established city-states and began a period of direct European interference in coastal politics and commerce. The Portuguese presence aimed at monopolizing trade routes and securing gold and other goods for European markets. The Portuguese did not simply replace Swahili authority overnight. Instead, the interaction produced contestation, collaboration, and adaptation. Some Swahili rulers allied with the Portuguese to strengthen their position against rivals. Others resisted fiercely. Over time, Portuguese power waxed and waned. By the late 17th century, Omani Arabs began to roll back Portuguese influence, capturing Mombasa in 1698 and establishing strong commercial and political links along the coast that culminated in the rise of the Sultanate of Oman's influence over Zanzibar. These shifting hegemonies show how the Swahili coast remained an international arena of diplomacy and rivalry long after its medieval peak. The inland connections of the Swahili coast were no less vital than its maritime ties. Coastal merchants depended on inland networks to supply gold, ivory, and slaves. Sofala, a port in present-day Mozambique, functioned as a key node for gold from the Zimbabwean plateau. Arab and Swahili traders organized caravans and partnerships with inland elites to move commodities to the coast. The corridor between the interior and the coast was a zone of negotiation. Local rulers, caravan leaders, and coastal merchants all brokered access, sharing spoils and shaping political relations across ecological and cultural boundaries.
Slavery formed part of the Indian Ocean economy, tied to the Swahili world, though its scale and character differed in some ways from the Atlantic trade that would later dominate European narratives. The Indian Ocean slave trade moved enslaved people to destinations across Arabia, Persia, India, and the islands of the Indian Ocean to serve in plantations, domestic service, and military roles. The 19th century rise of plantation agriculture on Zanzibar, notably clove cultivation under Omani and Sultanate rule, intensified demand for labor and made the island a major center for the regional slave trade. These are troubling but well-documented aspects of Swahili coastal history. Culture on the Swahili coast was cosmopolitan and creative. Language, dress, cuisine, and music show Indian Ocean influences layered on African foundations. Kiswahili itself, written in Arabic script in medieval centuries and later Latin script, became a lingua franca across East Africa. Coastal elite culture displayed luxury goods, Chinese porcelain, Persian silks, Indian cottons, but those imports were reworked into local forms. Ceramics were repaired and reused. Imported beads became elements in bridal trousseaux, and foreign architectural motifs were adapted to coral stone construction. Artisans and boat builders transmitted technical knowledge that was central to maintaining maritime networks. Archaeology has been the decisive corrective to many older misconceptions. Excavations at Kilwa, Songominara, Pate, and other sites have yielded datable ceramics, Chinese porcelain, Islamic coins, and organic remains that place the coast firmly within a high-volume, long-term trade network from at least the 9th century. Radiocarbon dating and stratigraphic analysis anchor occupation sequences and show peaks of urban activity during the medieval centuries. These material lines of evidence, dovetailed with travelers' accounts like Ibn Battuta's and later European records, produce a reliable chronological framework for understanding Swahili prominence and transformation. The decline of many medieval Swahili cities after the 15th century is complex and multifactorial. Portuguese disruption of trade, shifts in Indian Ocean demand, changing political alliances, and environmental stressors all played roles. Yet the Swahili world did not vanish. Many towns persisted, transformed, or shifted focus. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, Omani influence and later European colonialism reoriented coastal economies toward new crops and markets, especially Zanzibar's clove plantations, while leaving traces of the older maritime culture. Modern coastal towns preserve architecture, linguistic patterns, and commercial rhythms that echo their medieval past. The Swahili coast's global significance is clearer in hindsight. It was an African maritime civilization that connected hinterlands to the Indian Ocean world on terms the region shaped. The coast served as a conduit for goods and ideas, a place where African, Arab, Persian, Indian, and later European actors negotiated new forms of commerce and polity. Its legacy endures not only in ruins and manuscripts, but in Kiswahili language, coastal legal traditions, and the living cultures of East Africa. Visually and narratively, telling this story means balancing shipboard vistas with market detail. The sweep of dhows crossing the open sea, hands threading a string of traded beads, pottery sherds under brush at an excavation, a mosque's carved mihrab catching the sun, a merchant weighing gold dust on his scale. It means hearing Ibn Battuta's astonishment, reading coral stone inscriptions, and listening to local oral historians who keep place-based memory alive. That composite approach lets the Swahili coast speak as a network of seas, not as a footnote to other histories.
Forgetting is not an absence, it is often an act. Empires, collectors, and institutions have choices about what to write down, what to display, and what to take away. When those choices align with power, entire histories can be displaced, silenced, or rewritten. This episode asks a clear question. How did world-shaping polities, Ghana and Mali, Great Zimbabwe, Benin, Kush, and the Swahili city-states become footnotes in many global histories? The answer lies in a set of deliberate mechanisms: looting and dispersal, racist intellectual frameworks, selective archaeology and archival bias, the destruction of sources, and the reallocation of meaning through museums and education. The most visible mechanism is physical removal. When objects are taken from their original social contexts, their meanings shrink. The British punitive expedition of 1897 that sacked Benin City is a stark example. Palace plaques, regalia, and thousands of bronzes were seized and dispersed to museums and collectors across Europe. For decades, those objects were admired visually, but their ritual and political roles were often ignored or misrepresented in display labels, turning active instruments of statecraft into art objects divorced from their civic contexts. Recent international restitutions, such as the Netherlands' 2025 handover of 119 Benin pieces to Nigeria, show how long these processes last and how difficult it is to reconnect objects to the communities that made them. Looting is only one channel. Another is scholarly and institutional suppression, what intellectual historians call Eurocentrism or Orientalist framing. From the 18th through much of the 20th century, many European scholars explained African complexity away. Sophisticated stone cities must be foreign-built. Elaborate metalwork must be the product of outside craftspeople. These assumptions were reinforced by colonial administrations that had political reasons to cast colonized peoples as less capable of statecraft. The critique of such frameworks, most famously articulated by Edward Said and the School of Post-Colonial Studies, shows how scholarly narratives can naturalize unequal power relations and make forgetting an academic practice as much as a political one. Great Zimbabwe gives this point painful clarity. Early European observers refused to accept an African origin for its monumental dry stone walls, offering instead fantasies of lost white civilizations or Phoenician builders.
it took rigorous archaeological methods, stratigraphy, pottery sequences, and radiocarbon dating to overturn these claims. Gertrude Caton Thompson's 1929 fieldwork helped re-establish that Great Zimbabwe was the product of local Bantu-speaking peoples centuries earlier. Yet the earlier myths persisted in popular and some scholarly accounts for decades. That persistence shaped public perception and policy long after the facts were clear. The archive itself can also be fragile. Timbuktu's manuscript libraries, which preserved Islamic jurisprudence, astronomy, medicine, and local chronicles for centuries, survived drought, neglect, and the vicissitudes of politics until violent extremists sought to erase them in 2012. Local librarians and guardians risked everything to smuggle tens of thousands of manuscripts to safety, some hidden in rice sacks or transported by donkey, thereby saving a core of West Africa's written heritage. The later international conservation and repatriation efforts show both the vulnerability of such archives and the heroic local work that preserves memory against deliberate destruction. Erasure can be bureaucratic and educational as well. Colonial schooling often taught imperial histories that emphasized metropolitan achievements and downplayed colonized people's institutions. Textbooks and curricula, written in the colonizer's language, framed civilization in narrow terms, often defined by industrialization, centralized bureaucracy, or European legal categories, marginalizing forms of African governance and knowledge that did not fit those templates. Over generations, that pedagogical shaping produced publics in both Europe and African colonies with distorted pictures of the past. Correcting that distortion requires not only new research, but new education policies and museum practices. The politics of expertise also mattered. Early excavations and collecting expeditions were often led by men whose priorities reflected imperial goals, mapping resources, demonstrating control, and acquiring prestige objects, rather than documenting indigenous lifeways. Museums in the imperial capitals became gatekeepers. They selected which artifacts were worthy of display and wrote the labels that framed how distant publics understood those artifacts. When these curatorial decisions were made without meaningful input from source communities, histories were inevitably flattened. Complex social practices were reduced to exotic curiosities. Technology and shifting trade networks played subtler roles too. The routes that once carried gold, ivory, and ideas could be rerouted by new maritime technology, changed demand, or violent conquest. The Moroccan expedition of 1591 that defeated Songhai forces at Tondibi used gunpowder weapons to disrupt a river-based empire. The result was not only political collapse, but a reorientation of trade and administrative networks that had sustained memory and literacy centers. When centers of production and exchange fragment, so too does the documentary apparatus that records their activities. Forgetting has costs that go beyond scholarly embarrassment. When artifacts are removed, when texts are burned or hidden, entire knowledge systems, medical remedies, land tenure records, legal precedents, and genealogies can be severed. Those losses impoverish contemporary communities attempting to reconstruct social memory, and they can hamper legal and political claims based on continuity of tradition. Moreover, forgetting can be weaponized. Colonial authorities sometimes deliberately suppressed histories that legitimated resistance, or reframed past rulers as illegitimate to facilitate imperial governance. Recovery, therefore, is both an intellectual and moral project.
Yet forgetting is not total. Archaeology, philology, and local custodianship have repeatedly recovered what official narratives attempted to erase. Timbuktu's manuscripts, once smuggled to Bamako and later conserved and digitized, are now being returned. an act that restores physical custody and renews possibilities for study and local cultural life. Similarly, repatriation of the Benin bronzes, accelerating in the 2020s with major returns and agreements, has forced museums and governments to reckon with provenance and repair some of the cultural damage of colonial looting. These are not symbolic gestures alone. Returned objects and archives re-anchor histories in the communities that produced them. The restitution movement does not erase difficult questions. Who should steward returned objects? National governments? Traditional authorities? Local museums? Or shared international arrangements? How do we conserve fragile materials that spent a century in different climates? And how do we tell balanced histories that acknowledge global circulation while centering local meanings? These debates matter because the answers will shape what future generations learn about the past, and who gets to tell that past. Correcting the record also requires methodological humility. For too long, scholars treated written Arabic and European chronicles as sole authorities, sidelining oral traditions, material culture, and indigenous chronologies. Modern interdisciplinary work, combining radiocarbon dating, paleo-environmental science, archaeometry, manuscript cataloging, and sustained engagement with oral historians, has produced far richer, more defensible reconstructions. The case of Great Zimbabwe, where pottery sequences, radiocarbon dates, and local genealogies converged to confirm African authorship, illustrates how multiple archives create stronger historical claims than any single source alone. Legal and ethical frameworks are catching up too. International conventions, like the 1970 UNESCO Convention Against Illicit Trafficking in Cultural Property, and bilateral agreements between states encourage provenance research and repatriation. But laws are only part of the solution. Political will, museum collaboration, and investment in local conservation infrastructure are essential to make returns meaningful. The Netherlands' transfer of Benin objects in 2025, for instance, included commitments to storage and conservation facilities in Nigeria, recognizing that restitution must be paired with capacity building. Memory work also happens outside courts and museums. Local communities, griots, custodial families, and religious institutions have kept traditions alive in ways that often escaped colonial notice. In Timbuktu, mosque custodians and family libraries preserved texts. In Benin, palace genealogists and ritual specialists maintained oral chronologies. In Great Zimbabwe's regions, place-based myths and craft lineages persisted. Partnering with these custodians, listening to their priorities, recording their knowledge, and supporting local scholarship is a necessary corrective to top-down recovery projects. The epistemic recovery of lost histories also invites a moral reorientation. Accepting that many of our standard historical frames were narrow or biased does not mean abandoning scholarship. It means expanding its methods and ethics. It means teaching school children about empires that organized learning and law in Africa. It means curators writing labels that explain objects' ceremonial functions. It means funding conservators in source countries and returning artifacts when their provenance is clearly colonial theft. These are practical steps with profound symbolic effects. They signaled that history belongs to those who made it, not only to those who wrote it down in colonial capitals. Finally, forgetting is reversible but demanding. It requires patience, resources, and care. It asks institutions to reckon with uncomfortable roots. It asks scholars to practice methodological plurality. It asks the public to reconsider comfortable narratives about the past. The work is ongoing. Manuscripts return to Timbuktu's dry vaults. Benin bronzes come home in crates. Excavations at forgotten sites continue to reopen lines of inquiry. Each recovered object, each digitized manuscript, and each oral history interview stitches back a fragment of a past that was never truly empty, only misread, miscast, and mislaid.
For centuries, whole chapters of Africa's past lay under dust, in private hands, or in the margins of textbooks. Today, those chapters are being rewritten, not by a single discovery,
but by a chorus of care. Archaeologists applying radiocarbon and context-aware excavation, librarians conserving fragile manuscripts, museums negotiating provenance and returning objects, and local communities insisting on the right to steward their own stories. These combined efforts are restoring the material anchors that let memory speak. The returns of looted objects have become unmistakable milestones. In 2025, the Netherlands handed over 119 Benin sculptures to Nigeria, one of several high-profile restitutions that have accelerated since the 2010s and forced museums to confront colonial provenance and ethical stewardship. Each crate returned is both a material repair and a prompt for difficult conversations about conservation, custody, and collaboration between institutions. Archives long thought endangered are finding new life. Tens of thousands of Timbuktu's manuscripts, smuggled to safety during the 2012-13 conflict and conserved in Bamako for years, have begun returning to their desert repositories, now with digitization and preservation programs in place. That work protects legal texts, medical recipes, astronomical tables, and local histories that complicate old assumptions about African knowledge systems and literacy. The manuscript's rescue and gradual reintegration illustrate how local initiative, international support, and technical conservation can revive written traditions once declared lost. Scientific advances are also changing the story. Recent archaeometry, paleo-environmental studies, and interdisciplinary projects across West, East, Central, and Southern Africa have produced firmer chronologies and linked material culture to trade, climate, and social change. Those data streams allow historians to move beyond simplistic models and to see empires as networks of people, goods, ideas, and institutions, complex systems that can be reconstructed with methodical care. Crucially, the reawakening is not just about objects or papers, it's about agency. Returning artifacts and rebuilding archives matters most when communities lead interpretation, conservation, and display. Museums are beginning to agree to long-term loans, shared curation, and capacity building that support local conservation labs and training. Local custodians, griots, mosque librarians, and palace archivists are essential partners. Their knowledge and priorities reshape how history is told and taught. There are hard questions ahead. Who holds ownership? How to fund conservation? How to balance international scholarship with community needs? And how to teach these recovered histories in schools? But the momentum is real. Legal frameworks such as UNESCO conventions, bilateral agreements, and museum ethics codes are giving structure to restitution and preservation, while grassroots projects digitize manuscripts, train conservators, and expand local museum capacity. Together, these fields create a practical path from repair to renewal. The reawakening is both symbolic and technical. Symbolic because recovered objects restore dignity and narrative wholeness. Technical because conservation, cataloging, and collaborative curation make those stories durable. As Sleeping History closes this series, the point is simple. History sleeps when power silences memory. It wakes when communities, scholars, and institutions choose to listen, repair, and pass knowledge forward. If you want to follow the projects that are waking these histories, new excavations, manuscript digitization initiatives, and restitution developments, subscribe and ring the bell. Join us as we track the scholars, custodians, and communities who are not just uncovering the past, but rebuilding its place in the present.